The final state of a star can be very uneventful, sort of quietly just burn away, like a white dwarf can just slowly, slowly lose its heat as it radiates into space and burn out, like a dying ember in a fire. Or it can have a very explosive ending, and it could be for a low mass star or a high mass star. Either of the two could end up as an explosion. And so we'll talk about the details of those and look at some pictures of stellar explosions. So we'll start with the high mass star this time. What we're looking at in the picture, this is called the Crab Nebula. This is a supernova. So an exploding star is called a supernova. And this one was a result of a high mass star. First imploding as it collapses on itself, and then the material rebounds off the core of neutrons and explodes into space. These supernovas are sometimes called core collapse supernova or type 2 supernova. So a type 2 supernova looks something like this here. It's called the Crab Nebula because the shape is sort of like a crab shell. We'll come back to this one in more detail. But before we move on, high mass star will eventually follow this process. So for low mass stars, they may become a supernova. For a high mass star, it will become a supernova. It will collapse on itself and rebound in a core collapse or a type 2 supernova. Now, supernovae are so bright that they can actually be seen from outside of a galaxy. So these are images here of 5 different galaxies showing the before and after a supernova has gone off. All right, so in the bottom, you have before the supernova, and then in the top, you have after the supernova. And so each of them, you see it like a new star appear. That new star that appeared is a supernova explosion. So the light from that one star is competing with the hundreds of billions of stars in the entire galaxy. It's essentially as luminous as the entire galaxy itself. It's kind of amazing. Now, supernovas have been observed for hundreds of years, although they weren't really known at the time what it was. But Johannes Kepler famously observed a supernova. This image here shows this like a modern analysis of what that supernova looks like now. But we have records showing that Kepler recorded observations of this supernova 400 years ago. It was so bright that you could see it in the night sky. It was like a new star had appeared. And so it would have been a very significant effect. Now today we can't see the supernova with naked eye, this supernova with naked eye, but we can still see its radiation when we look at it with a telescope. So the top 2 images over here are in X-ray. This is a Hubble, so obviously it's a lot dimmer in Hubble because the visible light has faded away, but infrared, we can also see infrared. But this is still radiating away. It's just not as bright as it was when Kepler first observed it. Here's another picture of a galaxy, and we blow up the image here. This is called the Cigar Galaxy. It's 11.5 million light years from us, and we can blow up the image of this galaxy to see a supernova that occurred here. So this is from 2014. So supernovas are recorded in other galaxies on a fairly regular basis. Now, our most detailed observations come from one specific supernova. This is called supernova 1987A. It was the first one observed once we knew about supernovas. So, like as I said, Kepler saw one but didn't know what it was, didn't have the equipment to study it like we do today. Supernova 1987A happened when we had the tools to track its evolution and see how its brightness would change over time. And so we can take a look at the image, how it looked in 1997 compared to 2003, and we could actually plot out how its apparent magnitude changed over time. So we got a nice data reading on how the light from the supernova changed over time from this one particular supernova. Okay, so let's come back to the Crab Nebula and take a look at what's there, what's left behind there. So the Crab Nebula itself is one of these type 2 supernova explosions. And when you zoom in on the core, you see an object like this. Oops, did not mean to drag it. Okay. So at the very core of this supernova, there's still something there. And this is an X-ray image. I think it might be a composite image, but it certainly includes X-ray data of what's at the core. You can sort of see it looks like a swirling disk and then jets of gas coming out of the axis of rotation. Well, at the center of this, what we know is there is a neutron star. It's essentially a ball of neutrons that were created when the star imploded. Everything outside was exploded away, but there's still other things happening here that need to be addressed. Like, what's all this other stuff around it, and why is it doing what it's doing? So these types of objects were actually recorded, observed, before we understood what they were. And the way we observed them was we noticed objects that had this very regular pulsation period. They were like flickering. Their light was going up and down and up and down and up and down on a very rapid time scale, in the order of like milliseconds. On a millisecond time scale, the light was going up and down, up and down, up and down. And it was so regular, so perfectly regular, that there was a lot of speculation about what that could be. What are these stars in the sky that are flickering on a very, very regular, periodic way? So the first thought was, well, maybe it's some sort of alien communication, right? What in nature could produce that flickering on such a regular, perfect, periodic way? And so they were started to be cataloged as LGM, where LGM stood for little green men. So they were LGM1, LGM2. We now call these objects pulsars. They're still cataloged this way. And there weren't aliens. They weren't alien contact. Instead, Jocelyn Bell, who discovered these pulsars, eventually figured out that what these are the results of the collapsed high mass star. They're neutron stars, and because when they collapsed, they were initially spinning, the collapse made them spin very, very fast. And so the material that got ejected sort of along the axis of rotation, or a lot of the radiation came out of the axis of rotation. And as the stars are spinning around, that axis of rotation, or the radiation beams, are alternately hitting us and then spinning around and away from us. So it's sort of like acting as a lighthouse. So if you imagine this is the neutron star some distance from us, and here we are here on Earth, and it's rotating around this way, and these beams of radiation that are coming out, so if I go back to the previous picture here, these beams of radiation are swinging around and hitting us and then going away, and swinging around and going away. And so that rotation is causing the light to flicker in a very, very periodic way. And so these are pulsars. They're neutron stars, and they're leftovers of a high mass star that has collapsed in on itself and then gone supernova. Once all of the excess gases has drifted away, that pulsar remains behind. And we've now identified many of these pulsars on different time scales, spinning at different rates. And there's an entire catalog of these pulsars. All right. So now we have identified a couple of different end states: neutron stars, which could also be pulsars, and white dwarfs. So high mass stars we have in the neutron star category, low mass stars end up in the white dwarf category. So let's look at a quick comparison of the two. So for white dwarfs, we mentioned that they have to be less than 1.4 solar masses. For neutron stars, they're in between that, so they're always bigger than this, but they're smaller than 3. So what happens to the bigger? Well, they become black holes. We'll get more into that next week. But this mass range here refers to the mass that's left over after the supernova explosion. So after the supernova explosion, a lot of the mass has been thrown away, exploded into space. As long as the mass is in this range, it will collapse and stay as a neutron star or a pulsar. And then the smaller stars like the sun, after they've gone through their planetary nebula phase, as long as 1.4 solar masses of stuff or less is there, they will be white dwarf stars. All right, so now that we've kind of covered what happens with the high mass stars, what about low mass stars? Are they just resigned to slowly burn out as white dwarfs? Well, for some of them, for example, for the sun, that's what they will do. With what our best ideas of what's going to happen to the sun is it's going to eventually become a white dwarf that slowly cools down over trillions of years. But if a low mass star has a companion, there are actually ways for it to come back to life. It can be rejuvenated by siphoning off gas from its companion star. And so the picture here illustrates a white dwarf star next to a regular star, a main sequence star, or maybe a red giant star, something that has an outer atmosphere that it can siphon material from. And when it does that, the material can fall onto the star and burn up, and we get what's called a nova. So it's like the material just gets pulled by gravity, siphons onto the star. As it swirls onto the surface, it heats up and burns up in these nova, which is a word that means a new star. So it essentially comes back to life. But that's not the end. So that can happen, these nova can happen, which is different from a supernova, if the siphoning is strong enough and the star that's there, the white dwarf star that's there, can accumulate enough matter to hit that 1.4 solar mass mark, then it will become a supernova. And so what's the difference here? So if the mass of the white dwarf is way under that 1.4 limit, then the material falling in will just burn up and sort of fizzle away, and the star will sort of flare up for a period of time and then burn out again. But if it hits that 1.4 times the mass of the sun limit, the star is not stable. Recall back to what a white dwarf star is. It's basically a collection of carbon atoms, right? The electrons have been pushed close to one another of the carbon atoms. It's basically a ball of tightly packed carbon atoms. But it wasn't heavy enough to burn carbon. That's where the 1.4 solar mass limit comes. If the sun reaches that weight, it is enough to ignite carbon fusion. And so at that point, the carbon will essentially begin to fuse immediately. But it will happen everywhere inside the star at once, essentially everywhere inside the star at once. And so rather than the star collapsing and then rebounding and exploding, it will essentially detonate. It's almost like that once that it's near that limit, one more molecule or one more atom piles onto the surface and the star explodes in a detonation. Now, this is a different type of supernova, so it's called a white dwarf supernova or a type 1a supernova. That mass limit is named after the theoretical physicist who figured it out, and so it's called the Chandrasekhar mass. The Chandra Space Telescope is also named after the same individual. And so with a low mass star, if there's a companion, it can siphon off material from the companion. If it siphons up to the Chandrasekhar mass, it will immediately detonate in a white dwarf or type 1A supernova explosion. And the two types of supernova that we've talked about, the type 1A and the type 2, there's a type 1B, but they're less common and we're going to ignore them. So we'll just focus on these two types. They can be distinguished. And they can be distinguished by a couple of different ways. First, if you look at the spectra, the type 1A do not contain hydrogen lines because the hydrogen went away with the planetary nebula. The type 2 will have strong hydrogen lines. So just by looking at the spectra, we can detect whether or not we're looking at a type 1A or a type 2. There's other types here, you can ignore these ones, but just comparing the type 1A to the type 2. So you see the big bump here, that indicates strong hydrogen presence. And then there's not a similar bump here for the type 1A. All the hydrogen's gone. And then second, the type 1A supernova all have the exact same luminosity. And this is the most important factor for our purposes. The type 1A supernova all have the exact same luminosity because they're going to occur when the star reaches that Chandrasekhar mass. As long as it happens at that exact same mass every time, it's going to have the exact same luminosity every time. So type 1A supernova can be used as standard candles. Type 2 supernova, their luminosities will depend on however big the star was to start. But for type 1A, it's happening in a different way. It's starting out below the Chandrasekhar mass and it will explode as soon as it gets there. So it's always going to happen with exactly the same luminosity. So whenever we identify a type 1A supernova, we know its true luminosity. We can compare to its apparent magnitude. And as we were talking about last week, that gives us the distance to the star. And so these type 1A supernova are standard candles, and they allow us to measure the distance to things that are outside of our own galaxy, because we can see type 1A supernovae happening in other galaxies because their light is so bright. Now lastly, these supernovae are important for understanding how stars work, but they're also important for life itself in the universe. And the reason for that is they are responsible for creating all of the other elements on the periodic table above iron. So for elements under iron, we've already come to understand that stars produce them by fusion. Where do all the other elements come from? The universe would have started as essentially a soup of hydrogen and maybe a little bit of helium. Stars have produced everything up to iron by their life cycles on the main sequence and going through giant phases. Well, where do we go from there? Where do all the other elements on this periodic table come from? Well, it's through these stellar explosions and other cosmic events. And a large fraction of them are happening during supernova. The supernova explosion does two things. It creates the pressure that can fuse atoms together that otherwise wouldn't fuse, because the fusion doesn't produce energy, it requires energy. The energy of the supernova can fuse heavier elements. And in addition, it spreads those elements all over the galaxy. Meaning that when new star systems form, the population of material that's in those molecular clouds is changing with each generation of stars. With each generation of stars, the percentage of hydrogen goes down and the percentages of all the other elements starts to go up a little bit. And so the first generation of stars were all pure hydrogen. The next generation had a little bit more heavier elements in it, and the next generation a little bit more heavier elements in it. And over time, these heavier elements are becoming more and more highly populated within the universe. The periodic table here shows you what the source is for each of the elements on the periodic table. So if we look at carbon, we're carbon-based life forms. Where does the carbon come from? Well, it comes from dying low-mass stars and some exploding massive stars. So the carbon that you're made from was produced in low-mass stars and high-mass stars and then exploded into a molecular cloud where the sun formed some 5 billion years ago. The same for the oxygen and nitrogen. Anything in yellow or green that you see here was produced in dying low-mass stars or exploding massive stars. Some exploding white dwarfs, that's the gray. And then there's some other things here that we haven't talked about, like cosmic ray fission, and merging neutron stars can produce these heavier elements. And then there are some that are just human synthesized, like these ones here, were made by humans. They don't occur in nature. The blue are the ones that were produced through the Big Bang. They are sort of what filled the universe from the beginning. And so this is an interesting thing to think about, that we literally are made of stuff that was produced in the stars. If stars didn't explode, that stuff wouldn't spread out into the universe, and new stars wouldn't be made from that leftover material. So it's kind of a cool thought to end on here. So that's essentially it for stellar evolution. We go from a molecular cloud, divide into whether it's a low mass or high mass star. It follows a different process. Eventually, that star will exhaust its nuclear fuel and collapse. Now, what happens as a result of that collapse depends on how much mass it started with. If it's a low mass star, you end up with a white dwarf. If it's a high mass star, you end up with a neutron core that will eventually rebound into a type 2 supernova. If it's a low mass star and it's a white dwarf, it could just burn out, or it could have a companion that it can siphon off some material until it gets to the point where it can explode in a type 1a supernova. And those supernova explosions are critical because they spread their material all over the universe, essentially seeding the universe with new, heavier elements that can comprise planets and life forms like us.